I'm going to talk today about leadership, and I hope to talk about it in a way that is distinctive. This is extremely hard. There are thousands of books that have been written about leadership. Some of them are good, and a lot of them are worth reading. So to try to find something different to say about leadership is not easy, but I'm going to give it a go. And the topic that we are going to explore is power. Oddly enough, in all those books that are written about leadership, you won't find many chapters titled Power. And that's because the word power has a lot of negative connotation in people's minds. I just want you to think about expressions you know that involve the word power that are not sort of positive expressions. See if you can give me one. Somebody put up their hand. Give me an expression about power that's not a good expression. Power hungry, thank you. Power corrupts, right. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Another one. What? Greedy. Ah, yes. In other words, lusting after the trappings that go with power, right? The corner office, the car, the clubs, the money, right? What else? There's lots others. There's power mad, right? Power trips, right? You've heard all of those? Yes, thank you, Sandy. Blind with power, that's right. There are all these negative expressions, so we tend to be shy about saying we want power. And yet, actually, wanting power, if you're going to be a leader, turns out to be extremely important. But we're Canadians, so we don't like to say we want power, unless you're a politician or something. But for the most part, people are shy about saying it. But the truth of the matter is, if you're a leader and you want to get stuff done, you need power to get it done. For the purpose of today's discussion, the word power means the ability, that is, having the scope and authority to achieve organizational goals. And many, many organizations fail to achieve their goals because the leaders within the organizations will not exercise the power that's available to them. Okay, they'll be shy about it. Okay, for some combination of the fact that all that sort of verbal baggage we just talked about kind of makes them a little bit shy about it. But the other thing is that when you demand power, when you say, I need more power, you're also saying, I accept more accountability for whether or not the results that are achieved are the ones that I set out to achieve. So with power goes accountability. But without power, and if you're a leader in an organization, you simply cannot do some of the things that you should be doing to achieve your organization's goals. Okay, now we're going to take a long diversion because it's going to be very important to set up this word. And we're going to talk for the moment about Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo is a great writer, and one of his most famous books, of course, is Les Miserables. And how many of you have seen the play, Les Miserables? Quite a few of you have seen the play. How many of you read the book? In French. Oh, very impressive, because it's a long book. So some of you know the story of the bishop's candlesticks. Those of you who only saw the play if you blinked, you may have missed the story of the bishop's candlesticks. They do it in about 30 seconds on stage. But it takes actually the first 110 pages of the book is about the story of the bishop's candlestick. So I need to tell you this story for the benefit of those who didn't see the play even, or those who blinked when they did see the play and maybe missed it. We are introduced at the beginning to this person, the Bishop of Digne, who is appointed that way in a rather strange process that actually involves Napoleon. We don't even exactly know how he became a priest. His family had been prosperous. Some bad things happened during the revolution, and so he went off to Italy to sort of get out of the way of trouble, and when he came back, he was a priest. He has an odd encounter with Napoleon, and he becomes the bishop of a diocese called Digne. And he moves there, and at that time, if you were a bishop, lots of stuff came with that. A big house, a big income, some help, and a whole bunch of stuff like that. And that's not really the kind of guy that he is. So he takes his income, and he says 90% of it he dedicates to various charities to help orphans, to help war widows, to help various different kind of organizations that are trying to do good. He takes most of the income that's available to him and sends it in that direction. They live in a big house, and next to it is, they being he, his sister, and another woman who helps take care of the house. Next to it is a rather small house, which is used in a very cramped way as a hospital. So he looks at this, he says, this doesn't make any sense, and he goes and says to the hospital, you move into the big house, we'll move into the small house, because you need all that big space more than we do. So you're kind of getting a feeling for the character of this fellow, the Bishop of Digne. And we learned quite a bit more about him during this period. So another person, Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean has just been released from prison after 19 years. He was in prison for 8 years for stealing a loaf of bread, and 11 more years because he tried to escape. He is a hardened man and very bitter. And he is released, and at that time, when you were an ex-con, which is what he is, whenever you went somewhere, you had to show people your slip, your yellow ticket of leave is what they called it in the play, which tells everybody that you're an ex-con. So he goes from town to town. All he wants to do is have a place to sleep and maybe get something to eat, and people keep turning him away. They won't let him sort of set up shop or even find a resting place anywhere he goes. Finally, he's in the place where the bishop lives, and a woman points at the door and says, knock on that door, maybe something will happen. He knocks on the door, the bishop opens the door and welcomes him in. And the guy says, I need to tell you about myself. He says, it's okay. He come on in. He brings him in, he allows him to bathe. They set the table, and they don't just set the table. He takes out the silver plateware and the silver candlesticks that are really the only valuable things that he's retained through all this period. And they have dinner. And he says to Jean Valjean, you should stay the night, and then in the morning you can be on your way. In the middle of the night, Valjean wakes up, and he goes and he's sort of torn, but he goes and he steals the silver plates and the knives and forks, and he runs away. The next morning, he's caught, and the gendarmes catch him. They recognize the silverware. They bring him to the bishop's door, and they knock and they say, Bishop, we caught this fellow. We're taking him back to jail. Here's your silver, your silver plates and so on. They say, but this fellow says this crazy story. He says you gave them to him. I mean, we all know that's not true. And the bishop looks at the gendarmes. He thanks them for their work. He says, it is true that I gave him those. But more than that, he looks at Valjean. He says, you forgot. I gave you the candlesticks too. And he goes and gets the candlesticks and puts them in the bag and sends them away. You forgot. I gave you the candlesticks too. And sends them away. And that 110 pages sets up the rest of the book, in which Valjean is now the principal. That's the last time we see the bishop in the book. The rest of the story is about Valjean and the transformative impact this has on him. Now, a very interesting question for you to ask yourself as you read that story, as you heard that story, is when did the bishop make that decision? When did he decide that it was a good idea for Valjean to have the silverware and the candlesticks? And you might come up with all kinds of different answers. You might say, well, it was when he saw Valjean knock at the door. It may be when he heard about all the troubles that he'd been through over supper. It may be when he kind of decided to put the best silverware out for supper. Maybe it wasn't until the knock came on the door and he saw the gendarme there with him and he was going to have to go back to jail. There's all kinds of different answers. One thing I think you can be sure of is that when he noticed the silverware was missing in the morning, he didn't say, oh gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do now. And he sort of went up and looked up, Luke chapter 6, verse 29 and said, what do I do now? If you really think about it, my answer to the question is, when did he make that decision, is that it was as natural for him to do that as it was for you and I to breathe. If you read everything else that it said about the bishop up until that point, you realize that it would have been totally out of character for him to do anything other than what he did, both with the silver plateware and with the candlesticks. That's who he was. That's what his values were, and those values were very deeply rooted with him as a person. And so it was actually perfectly natural for him to do something, which when we hear the story, sounds kind of astonishing that he would do that. But actually, and the reason why I think Hugo spends 110 pages setting up that moment is to understand that that was perfectly natural. And the title of the chapter in which he does this is The Bishop at Work. It's really Hugo saying, this is the bishop being himself. Now, it's a wonder. I love that story. I love telling the story. And I love it because it's all about values and the importance of having values well installed within individuals, and for that matter, within organizations. If you think about the Sisters of Charity who founded this place, it was in pursuit and support of those kinds of values that this place was created. What the bishop experienced that we talked about is something I call a spotlight moment. And spotlight moments are ones where organizations, something happens to them, usually something stressful, not always stressful, usually something stressful. And what happens is that in that moment, people find out what they are really made of. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's not so good. If you want to think about not so good moments, when the Exxon Valdez crashed off Alaska, which was the biggest oil spill of its time until the Gulf one, in history, until the Gulf one last year, and it was being driven by a captain who was drunk. Everybody in the world said to themselves, actually, Exxon doesn't care a lot about environmental safety. All right, that was a spotlight moment on them, and it showed what their values were, and it showed that they weren't very good. When in the same decade in Bhopal, India, a plant owned by Union Carbide had a terrible, terrible accident. 2,000 people were killed, 100,000 people were injured by cyanide gas that leaked from their fertilizer plant. Everybody, and they had an identical plant in Georgia where they were much more careful about safety. Everybody in the world said, oh, Union Carbide thinks lives in India are worth less than lives in the United States. That spotlight just showed, that drew people to that conclusion, and it was too late for them to communicate anything else. There are sometimes good spotlight moments. I'll give you a very small one, but just because I love it, and then a slightly bigger one that all of you who are PR students will already know. The very small one, our new Governor General, who has 5 daughters, and somebody made the mistake, perhaps, of asking him, don't you ever wish you'd had a son? Do you know this story? Marvelous answer. He said, you haven't met my daughters. Anyway, that's a small spotlight moment, but I love his answer. A bigger one, the Johnson & Johnson case, as I say, a lot of you know about it. Again, in that decade of the 80s, Tylenol, their biggest product, $1 billion a year of product. That was a lot of money in the 1980s. Biggest product for Johnson & Johnson. Some psychopath in Chicago went into the store and tampered with some bottles of Tylenol, put cyanide in them, and a lot of people got sick. I think 7 people died. And now you're J&J, and you have to figure out what to do. And at the point in time that you have to figure out what to do, you're not even sure exactly what happened or why, or whether it was your production process or what. What they did do, apart from doing a marvelous job of communications, is they said they had a very well-ensconced set of values, and it gave them clear direction as to what to do. And they said, this is really simple. We're in the business of making people well. A bunch of people used our product and got sick. Some of them died. So we are taking every single pill off the shelf, not just in Chicago, not just in Illinois, not just in the US, but in the world. We're taking every Tylenol there is off the shelf, and we will not put them back on until we have figured out a way to prevent this from happening again. That was the invention of tamper-proof packaging. Now, I can tell you what didn't happen on the way to that choice. Their senior management team did not go away and have an offsite. Gee, guys, we should talk about our values so we know what we should do now. Right? If you don't know what your values are, at the moment that situation comes up, it is already too late. You are already going to get it wrong. But they had a very well-seated set of values, and if you go on their website and find it and realize that it was written in the 1940s, it's an extraordinary piece of work. For something written in the 1940s, it's an amazing piece of work. So that was the spotlight on them. They did very well. Johnson & Johnson, not in spite of that, but because of that kind of deep-seated values. If you were going to buy a pharmaceutical stocks in 1950 and hold it till today, that would be the best one you could possibly buy. So I'm a big believer in values as drivers of superior profitability. Okay, that's my aside about values, but it's very important because now we're going to talk about a story that is altogether less lovely. Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov. Who's read it? Not as many. 3? Including the president. Okay. So, the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky, and this is a little fable that appears in the middle of that story, and it's called The Grand Inquisitor. This is an entirely fictional story, but it is grounded in some history, which is the Spanish Inquisition. The beginning of the story, we're introduced to the Grand Inquisitor. He's 92 or something. He's old, he's wizened. He's just had, they were in the business of burning heretics in those days, really, okay? And he's just had a big bonfire the day before. He burned 100 heretics, so he's really feeling pretty chuffed. And everything's fine, and except that he notices he's walking by the big square out in front of the cathedral, and he notices that the crowd is very stirred. And what has happened in this fable is Christ has reappeared. And Christ is walking through the crowd, and people are starting to get a sense of who it is. Dostoevsky never uses the word Christ. He uses the word him with a capital H, but you figure it out. He reappears, and he walks, and he's in the crowd, and eventually they lead him to a young girl who's lying down and who they think is dead. And he, reenacting a story that you hear in the Bible, he goes over, he touches the girl, says, "Arise," and she does. And the crowd is just totally amazed. It's right back to, the year 23 AD or whatever it is, with these kinds of miracles are happening. The Inquisitor is not happy about this. And he looks at his guard, and he points, and he does this. He just says that. And the guards go to get Christ. And the crowd parts. They've just seen this big miracle, but they're terrified, for reasons you understand, of the cardinal and the guard. So they go, they arrest Christ, they bring him, and they put him in jail by himself. The Inquisitor goes down to see him, and he talks a lot. He says, "Why did you come back? We don't need you anymore." And it's funny, the Inquisitor is talking to Christ, but in some ways he's talking to himself. And he says, what we do, people don't want freedom. He uses the 3 temptations of Christ, not the last one in the movie, but the 3 temptations of Christ about bread, stones and power. And he walks them through all of those. He says, you wanted to give people freedom and all that stuff. They don't want that. They just want to be told what to do. we've taken that burden on. And then he says, the most amazing sentence in the whole thing, he says, we have corrected thy work. We don't need you back here. And the guy basically says, not these words, but he says, we've gone over to the dark side. Okay, we decided to serve the dread Lord because he understands that people don't want freedom. They just want to be coerced into doing what we think is good for them, and then they're going to be happy. He goes through this, and this takes a number of pages. If you know Russian literature, you know that this would take a number of pages. And at the very end of it, throughout it, he's threatening to burn Christ as well, but he says, no, just go and never come back. So he opens the prison door and tells Christ to go. And Christ, who has never said a word, still doesn't. He just goes over and he gives the cardinal a kiss and leaves. The last sentence in the story, the kiss glows in his heart, but he holds to his idea. But he holds to his idea. So think about the cardinal and think about, well, what's at the top of his list of priorities? And the answer is power. Right? That's what he cares more about than anything else, is power. This story is the reason we have lots, and there's lots of other ones I could have picked too, but this story is the reason we have lots of negative baggage around the word power, because it's power for its own sake. That is the top of his list of priorities, is power. It is power for his own sake. And he has completely perverted the foundations on which that power is based. I mean, think about the fact that the bishop and the cardinal, they both come from the same institution, right? The cardinal's got a couple more stripes, but they're both generals in the same army. And they're completely different people. We love the bishop, we hate the cardinal. Fair? The bishop, incidentally, uses every single bit of power he has. You should be able to judge that from the story, but you should also, even when he uses the silver, that's part of the power he has. He has the power to give that away. But he does it in service of the values that he believes in. In the case of the cardinal, those same values gave foundation, gave birth to the same institution that the bishop represents. But he's long since lost track of the values. Those values gave him the power, and now he doesn't care at all about the values anymore. It is only about the power. So I walk through those two stories when I'm doing leadership training, because I tell people that it is very important, if they are leaders, to exercise every bit of power they have, and in fact to go get some power, or see if they can get some power that they don't think they have. But it can never be for its own sake. It always has to be in service of the values of their organization and of the goals of their organization. And it's a very, very big distinction. One of the little exercises that we go through with people is I ask them to complete a sentence about their organization. And the sentence begins, we can't do that because ... And I asked people, I said, have you ever heard a sentence of that format in your organization? And everybody puts out their hand and says, yes. Here's my example. My boss won't like it, the union won't like it, faculty association won't like it, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough time. And I get this enormously long list. And I said to people, I said, it's so easy for people to do that. It's so easy for them to, if you think about the space that you're entitled to work within, if you think of it as a circle, it's so easy if that circle stays small. Okay, because then, it's all familiar territory to you, and you have less chance to screw up. But I said, your job is to look at all the walls around that circle and push on every one of them and find out whether it's made of paper or whether it's made out of brick. And some of them will be made out of brick, and you might bump your head, and that's too bad. But some of them, it will turn out, will be made of paper. And if you push on them, they will disappear, and you will have more power. And my view is that they should push on every wall that's there and get rid of the paper walls, because the more they do that, the more power they can get. But it always has to be to serve the values. It can never be for its own sake. And that's it's a very important distinction, but I go through that whole sequence so that people will not let that negative baggage around the word power restrain them. But they will understand that when they're pursuing it, they're never pursuing it for its own sake, but pursuing it for what they can do with it. Now that's pretty complicated stuff. This is a talk that's a lot easier to give to people who have been in leadership roles for a long time and have a certain amount of scar tissue from having done it. But I hope you'll remember the story. I hope many of you will be in big leadership roles. And this doesn't just have to be in businesses. This can be in universities, hospitals, can be anywhere in non-NGOs, anywhere, any kind of an organization. I want you to remember those two stories. And remember that your job, if you're a leader, is to get as much power as you can. Incidentally, one of the other negative things around the word power is people who have power and won't delegate it to those reporting to them, which is extremely annoying. And that's not what I'm talking about, okay? The whole idea is to get as much power as you can, and then having done so, delegate as much as you can, okay? But you can't delegate what you don't have. So before you can give people working for you power, you have to have it yourself. You can't give, to use some very bad English, you can't give what you don't got, all right? You have to get it first, and then as soon as you get it, then look for ways to give it to the people reporting to you. Some of you who are in roles, management roles, and reporting to leaders know how frustrating it is when a leader that you're reporting to won't exercise the power that she or he has. It's very, very annoying. And people really appreciate it when you will actually go and use what you have. Okay, that's rather a long monologue. I'm going to pause now, and you're supposed to ask intelligent questions. And I'm very patient. I'll just stand here for 20 minutes with silence. Or I'll ask you questions. That's another thing. Maybe I'll ask Ramona to talk about power that the board has versus the Senate at a university. Bicameral governance, right? But the board controls the purse strings, right? So really, that the board can run the show. You have to speak louder because they can't hear you. I can hear you. She has no voice, so I'm at an advantage here. I know. Hi, Renee. Well, did everybody hear the question? The question was, you know, given this sort of dichotomy I've been trying to create between power, wanting it but not wanting it for its own sake, and values which should be at the top, you know, how do you do a little gut check with yourself to make sure you don't get it wrong? Which is a good question. A couple things I would say. I believe it is enormously valuable and enormously important for organizations to actually try to write down what their values are and have a process which involves a lot of the people, not just senior people, but throughout the organization, in trying to articulate those values and then having done so, to have a ongoing process of communicating those values around the organization. Second thing is that if you think of organizational charts, the way I like to look at an organization chart is kind of an upside down triangle. So the top of the chart is customers or students or patients, depending on what you're talking about. Below that is the middle management people whose job should be, below that should be the customer-facing people. So their job is to try and make that top line happy with what's going on. Middle managers should be providing the technology, the tools, the training, so that those frontline people can succeed. And top management should actually be providing the overall strategy and the articulation and support of the values in the organization. It's a very simple organizational chart, but I find it very helpful. Now, if you say that, what you recognize is that the CEO of an organization is the most subordinate to the values. Okay, that is very, very important. The CEO is the most subordinate to the values. The day that a big decision comes up and there's some sort of tension between the values and something else, and the CEO says, well, we can't use the values here, the whole project is dead. The whole project is dead. You know, the whole point of the values is that when you have those spotlight moments, those stressful moments when you're not sure what to do, that the values give you some guidance and hopefully help you to get it right. So I guess the day, you know, a little litmus test I had was the day I even thought about not doing something consistent with our values, I knew there was a problem. Okay, because I was the most subordinate to the values in the organization. So that's not a complete answer, but it was very helpful to me to do that. Yes?
We seem to have many leaders who don't lead very well today in civic and political systems and processes. Are we afraid of strong leadership? We just won't let these people lead? It seems we used to have leaders.
Yeah, well, the question was, are we afraid of strong leadership? And first of all, being a political leader is extraordinarily difficult. Okay, I mean, it's way more complicated than running a big company, okay, because you have just such a great diversity of stuff you're dealing with. You're trying to rule with a cabinet, which is not of your choosing in many ways. You know, if you're a governor in Nova Scotia, maybe you've got 30, 35 members elected, and you've got to appoint a cabinet of 15 people. Well, if you were doing an executive search for 15 ministers, they probably wouldn't all come from those 35. Let's just say, all right? Think about who the 6th best minister is in Nova Scotia today or at any other day, and you'll see what I mean. So I think that political leaders have a very difficult job. Secondly, I'm going to respectfully disagree with your assertion that we don't like strong leaders. Jean Chrétien was a very strong leader, and I think was generally very successful as a politician. Stephen Harper, whatever his personality traits that some people might find unattractive are, he's a very strong leader. And and as a result of that, actually, that's why he won a majority in the last election. It was really in spite of some other characteristics, because he is a strong leader. The business of becoming, and I've tried, some of you would know, the business of becoming an elected premier or leader of a party it's a bit of a lottery. It's very arduous. It's amazing that anybody volunteers for it, really. We get a lot of weak ones, I know that, but sometimes I'm surprised we get as many good ones as we do. So.
Hi, the question I had was also pertaining to leadership. I wanted to know some of the tips that you would recommend for anyone who really wants to be a true leader, a visionary, and not someone who just manages, especially in
Right.
an environment that might be small where you're kind of all things.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. If I could recommend some readings to you, Jim Collins' Good to Great, of all those thousands of leadership books, one of the best. Even though 2 or 3 of the companies that he idolizes in his writing have completely flamed out, notwithstanding that, there's a lot of really good stuff in what he says. If you can find a copy, Robert Townsend, Up the Organization, 1972. Before you read it, rip out the chapters on technology and on women. They're embarrassing. You just have to realize they were written in 1972. So rip those chapters out and read Robert Townsend, Up the Organization. Very, very good book. I'll tell you an interesting thing I'll tell you a little bit of the differences as I perceive them. I was actually not a very good manager. Fortunately, nobody noticed that before I got to be a leader. And I was pretty good as a leader, but not very good. So there it is. I mean, there are differences. Managers will manage complexity. And leaders, to some extent, you kind of have to ignore the complexity. Okay? If you think too much about it, you'd never point and say, we need to go there. Little anecdote for you. Again, this is a little age test. Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter. How many people remember Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter? A few of the people in the room. They were both presidents of the U.S., okay? Now, those of you who remember Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, again, never mind what you think about their policies, whether you like Reagan's ideology or Carter's ideology. The question is, who was more effective in getting his ideas implemented? And the answer, hands down, is Reagan. Okay? Jimmy Carter, God bless him, would work 16 hours a day. He was right down into the detail of all kinds of different things, and he never got anything done. Ronald Reagan would give a very eloquent speech, great communicator, say, we're going to do this, and then he'd turn to his aides and say, make it so. You know, and he was very good at picking smart people to work with him. A reporter one day asked him, he said, you know, Mr. President, aren't you worried about some of these details? He said, yes, it's cost me many sleepless afternoons. Okay? That's Ronald Reagan ignoring complexity. Now, I call that management by conspicuous incompetence, and I think it has its place. Be careful how you use it. Or you might be, not in the right place. But there is something to what he was doing there, which was to sort of say, we need to get there, and I actually don't want to know about the details. Just kind of make it happen. Managers organize people, and I think leaders more orient people, okay, in terms of this is what we're trying to achieve as an organization. They kind of give people a lot of the whys, not so much on the what, So that would be another big distinction. So, anyway, read those two books. Another little quote, and you'll find this in the Townsend if you do it, and I want you to think about this one. This is 3,000 years BC, Lao Tzu. He said, to lead the people, walk behind them. To lead the people, walk behind them. Now, I want you to think about that. It's not actually always right. If you're Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of Canada, you have to spend quite a bit of time out front telling the world the bank's message about the economy and interest rates and inflation and so on. Okay, so you're not going to spend your whole time walking behind the people. But if you're walking in front of a group of people, you actually have no idea what's going on in their heads and how they're doing. If you're walking at the back of the group and they're walking in front of you, as long as they know where they're going, and that's why sometimes you have to go up front. But if you walk behind, then you can tell how the troops are doing. And there are times when that is very important. Last time I did this 2 years ago, the whole speech was built around Henry V's talk in the Shakespeare, of course, the Battle of Agincourt. Henry V, how many of you read Henry V? Ramona, I'm despairing of the quality of education you're giving here. Anyway, it's a wonderful speech that he gives, and the whole thing was built around that. What's very interesting is that in the period immediately before the speech, the troops are sitting around in a circle, and they're all upset. And they're concerned for a very good reason. They're cold, wet, hungry, and tired. They're suffering from dysentery, and they're outnumbered by the French about 4 to 1. and they all think that they're going to die, and that's actually a reasonable assumption. And one of the lieutenants stands up and says, gee, I wish we had more guys here. He doesn't say that. He says, would that we have 110,000 of our gentlemen now abed in England or something like that. But he said, I wish we had more guys here. Okay, so this group that's already down, Henry's sitting on the outside. Nobody even knows it's him out there, and watches his lieutenant bring everybody even further down. And then he goes up and makes a speech. But he does this because he knows where they're coming from. He knows what he's speaking to. So as a leader, you have to do that. You have to spend a lot of time inconspicuously noticing where people are. Okay? Here and then there.
Do you believe that as your company evolves, if you're starting up your own company, as it evolves, that you should, so to show your values of your company,
Should what?
should your company's values evolve with the added, because you're going to add a lot of different people, so
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very wonderful question. The question is, do your values change as your company grows? No, your corporate values. I'm going to answer a slightly different question than the one you asked. And then if you, and then if it doesn't work for your question, let's come back to it. Let's suppose that you're a company with 1,000 people and you're growing over a period of time to 2,000 people. Question is, should your values change? The answer is basically no. Why is it? It's because it's not like there's only one set of values that will work. Okay, there's lots of different good organizations have different sets of values, different ways they say to each other, this is the way we're going to behave. But the problem is, the day that you actually finish it and send it around to everybody and have a town hall meeting to tell everybody about it, employees who are smart look at each other and say, this too will pass, right? Management's been away again, we've seen this before, and this too will pass. That's a very reasonable thing for them to do, because that's what organizations do a lot of the time. If over the next 2 years, they constantly have experiences of the company trying to bring the values to life, they suspect that you may actually mean it. Okay, and somewhere between 3 and 5 years out, all of a sudden the values take on a life of their own and they animate the entire organization, and people feel very comfortable taking independent action based on the values, knowing that the company will support them. And that is when the whole world sings. That is when the whole thing becomes magic. Now, now that everybody's singing, and it's a constant work, it's never perfect, but now that everybody's singing, if you in year 8 say, we should really do this again, you know what you're going to have to do? You're going to have to go through that first 3-year thing again. So it's not a good idea, because people are in so many businesses, they have different products, different competitors, different technologies. Every day they come in, something's different. They need one thing that's the same every morning when they come in, and it should be the values. So that would be my it's not that what you have, unless there's a clear imperfection, a real problem with what's done, and that could be the case. But you should be very, very reluctant to change them, because the real energy comes when the thing sings. I'll tell you one little maritime life anecdote that I was very proud of. We did do 4 acquisitions, and when we bought Aetna Canada, I think the year is 2000, plus or minus a year, we were 900 employees, they were 1,000 employees. We were adding a lot of people at once. And so we did our little thing of introducing ourselves to people in the various cities we operated. But before we got to Montreal, our Montreal employees happened to work right across the street from where the Aetna office was. They had 100 folks, we had 100 folks. They knew each other a little bit, but not very much. Completely unprompted by management, nothing that came out of Halifax or anything. About, 5 or 10 of our folks went over and knocked on the door and, said to the reception, can we come in? And they said, yes. Yeah. Said, we're from Maritime. We know what you're going through. This is not fun. We need to tell you, you're really going to like it at Maritime. We really like it. Here's why we like it. And you're really going to like working there. So we know this is going to be tough, but hang in there because they're going to like it. Do you realize how much that's worth? That's worth $1 zillion. That is so much more credible than anything I could have said as president of the organization. That's singing. And that's what you get when you've worked for years, because we did our set of values in '92, when you've worked for years to make them real and people believe it. Long answer to your question. But yeah. Let's see, there's three of you right beside each other. The one in the middle, I think, was first. Yes?
You had mentioned the importance of a leader delegating power.
Yeah.
As an HR professional, how would you approach that? This whole table, we're from MSVU, we're the HR advanced diploma class.
Right.
And I think that's something we're going to have to do with.
Yeah. Well, it is. Now, if you're an HR professional, are you talking about if you're the manager of the HR department? Yeah, well, once you're the manager of the HR department, I'll tell you a very interesting thing to do sometimes. This is an organization chart thing. I should really have a whiteboard, but I don't. You guys are at HR, so you've seen org charts, right? Little box up here, line, da, 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 more boxes, line, more box, right? You know what I don't like about that? This will sound trite, but it works for me. Too much empty space. Okay? Too much empty space. What ends up happening, if you're the leader, you know what happens? You think you've delegated all this stuff, right? You get all the leftovers. Did you ever notice you get all the leftovers? Okay, well, beware of getting all the leftovers. Here's the way you should do your organization chart. Draw a great big circle. In the middle of it, put a little circle. And make a little pie thing out of the stuff between the two circles, and think about the people reporting you. We've got Alan and Barbara and Charlie and Donna and Edgar, right? They're all reporting to you, all right? So sit down with that, those 5 people and say, this big circle, which, by the way, I'm pushing on every wall on this to make it as big as possible. This thing here is what we collectively are accountable for. Okay, we collectively, you plus those 5, we're accountable for achieving these outcomes. Now, I've tentatively divided the pie up like this. It's probably not perfect, so you can argue with me, or if you want, you can argue with each other, negotiate the borders, but that's the whole job. So everything they think of what they're doing is in the context of the big job. Secondly, tell them, see this little circle? That's what I'm going to do myself. My job is to make that as small as possible. Okay? Conspicuous incompetence, very important. I'm not going to do very much except for try to be supportive of you in terms of your achievement of goals for the whole thing. You see the different feeling of that? So if you can start thinking of organization that way, I think it'll be a big help. I wish I had a board, but you all see it in the air there? Okay. 2 more questions. They were both, yes, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask you, how would you say you balance your own values with the company's values? How would that play into being really successful?
Yeah. How would you balance your own values with the company's? I'm so glad you asked that question. When we had our values written out, and we were being introduced to a group twice as big as this, because we had just bought a company, I would hold up and say, look, these are our values. We really mean it. Please read them carefully. If you don't feel comfortable with them, please don't join us. You won't like us, we won't like you, and it's all going to end in tears. Okay? And I would say that if I was interviewing particularly somebody who wanted to be a vice president, I said, read this really carefully. We really mean it. Don't join if you're not willing to be part of this. So the answer is, if your values don't fit the corporation, leave. Find a place that fits your values and that you're willing to commit to those values. Otherwise, it's just not good. Okay? Is that too vague an answer? No. One more behind there. No, you're done? Last call? Last call. Yeah, outcomes. Outcomes. As much as possible defines people's jobs in terms of outcomes. And think of the outcomes that you're accountable for, and if you can, in as large a measure as possible, so you can't delegate them all, I know that, but as large a measure as possible, say to various of them, these are the outcomes you're accountable for, you'll end up with way less of the leftovers. All right, that was a challenging topic. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the opportunity.